I don't know if I've ever mentioned in this podcast, but I have an MBA degree. It used to be a big deal back in the early 2000s when I got it. I got my degree from the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga. The Stockholm School of Economics opened its campus in Riga, Latvia in 2002. This location has been ranked as a leading business school in the Baltic and Nordic regions. When it opened, they only had bachelor's programs, and the education was subsidized, so they got the very sharpest minds from the entire Baltic region because the entrance exams were tough. At that time, I had already sold my beauty contest and talent show business, and apart from being a freelance translator, I also worked as an English teacher at one of the best public schools in Latvia. English was one of the specializations of this school, so they gave me more hours to work with my students than any other teachers had, and I was also allowed to be creative with the lesson plans of those extra hours. I believe the school's goal was to prepare its students for entrance exams at the most highly ranked college-level schools in Latvia or the Baltic region. My students were very motivated to get enrolled in those high-ranking schools. They also knew I used to have a successful business, so I used those extra hours creating the curricula around business English and financial and accounting terms in English. To prepare for those lessons, I had to do a lot of research, but it was satisfying. It was even more satisfying to see my students successfully enrolled in the programs of their first choice. Yet I also always felt that I didn't know enough, so eventually I decided to try to upgrade my education too. It was the second year the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga had an MBA program, so my competition was mostly executives from highly ranking companies and institutions. The requirements were English, and you either had to have a bachelor's degree in business or finance or had to have relevant business experience. When I got enrolled, I was by far not the smartest person in the group, but by the time I graduated, I might have grown the most. I had a lot of potential as to how I could develop from there. So, how did I end up waiting tables at a low-cost restaurant 20 years later? Welcome to She Became CEO, the podcast for women transforming body, mindset, relationships, and money. I'm your host, Ilse B., and here we speak boldly, heal deeply, and lead lives we're proud of. This is about becoming the CEO of your voice, your business, and your life on your terms. Let's begin. Recently, during a phone conversation with a friend, he said that if there is one word he thinks in association with me, that word is resilience. I thanked him for the compliment and then said, "But you don't know the whole story. I used to see this friend often before I moved away from the town he lives 3 years ago. We've met about 5 times in person since then, no more. We usually communicate via text or phone, and he listens to my podcast, so that's what he knows about me, apart from how he remembers me from those years ago. I don't think he can fully grasp how I have changed. One thing that has also changed is my understanding of resilience. I might have been resilient, but nobody's resilience is limitless. We are all fragile too, because we're human. If you remember, one of the things I said at the beginning of episode 25 was that the telltale signs that someone has been through trauma are not always obvious. Today, I want to expand on that topic. I will remind you about what I had said about trauma, go into the topic a little deeper, and also share about post-trauma syndromes, which is a word combination I haven't mentioned before. Why did I decide to talk about these things? Well, because you might realize that you are also not quite the person you used to be. But what you might not be aware of is that it might be because of trauma, and what would be helpful ways to think about it instead of self-deprecating. For credibility, I am going to cite Dr. Paul Conti's book, Trauma, the Invisible Epidemic, How Trauma Works and How We Can Heal from It. Dr. Paul Conti distinguishes 3 trauma types: acute, chronic, and vicarious, which I have mentioned in at least a couple of my earlier episodes, but I will remind you of them today and will give you more details. I'll just mention that when I talk about trauma, I usually add another trauma type, ancestral trauma, and that combination of 2 or more trauma types is known as complex trauma. Anyhow, the first trauma type, according to Dr. Paul Conti, is acute trauma. Acute trauma results from a particular event that most people would recognize as severe: a vicious attack, an injury in combat, witnessing violent death, a bad car accident, or a life-threatening medical crisis. In each of these, something occurs that creates a radically different experience of life from what came before it. Acute trauma is often accompanied by fear, pain, horror, intense vulnerability, and the loss of the illusion that we can predict or control life in such a way as to ward off disaster. People can be understandably distraught during and immediately following such an event, but sometimes people are eerily calm, as if a mental circuit breaker has been flipped, or the brain has taken itself offline in order to avoid becoming overwhelmed. Whether or not a person gets professional help later on, they are usually quite aware that something impactful has happened to them, and their life is noticeably different from what it was before. However, when it comes to chronic trauma, instead of one big event, chronic trauma comes from prolonged exposure to harmful situations and people, living under siege in wartime, experiencing ongoing sexual abuse as a child, enduring prejudice and racism, and so on. It isn't uncommon for a person suffering from chronic trauma not to be aware of it, or not to realize they've been living in traumatic circumstances until much later. Of course, sometimes we're quite aware of things our brains suppress, pushing them below the surface of consciousness, because we can't bear to live with the knowledge. It's like the trauma is an air-filled ball we keep trying to push beneath the surface of the water. It takes a lot of work to keep the ball down, and sometimes it bursts to the surface with enough force to hurt us. Among other things, chronic trauma can result in ongoing self-doubt, hopelessness, insecurity, fear, negativity about the world, and shame. Both acute and chronic trauma pave the way for shame, but chronic trauma allows shame to hide better. The vicarious trauma type is also a tricky one. We have the wonderful capacity to feel the emotions of others and to help them heal by extending our love and compassion, but we can also be harmed when we internalize their suffering. Vicarious trauma affects first responders and people in other helping professions, but it can also affect any compassionate person who doesn't shy away from the suffering of others. Being present with others can alleviate their pain and aloneness, but it can also let in their terror, and that terror can imprint in ways that mimic the direct experience of trauma. Of course, not everyone who is compassionate is personally affected by external suffering, or at least not to the same extent. It depends on the types of trauma a given person has experienced themselves, as well as how finely tuned their emotional compass is. Now, moving on to post-trauma syndromes, which was the term I promised I would talk about. When we think of trauma's long-term impacts, we often think of post-traumatic stress disorder, abbreviated as PTSD. PTSD is an acronym that gets used a lot in the media, And many people associate it with trauma even if they don't know exactly what it means. However, most people aren't aware that PTSD is just one of many ongoing issues that can result from trauma. A more meaningful way to think about the long-term impact of trauma is to consider the idea of post-trauma syndromes. They are an array of problems that affect a person's life in a negative way after trauma occurs, and PTSD is just one of these problems. Post-trauma syndromes can arise from acute, chronic, or vicarious trauma. And even though Dr. Paul Conti doesn't talk about the ancestral trauma, I would mention that we can experience post-trauma syndromes if we are suffering from ancestral trauma as well. Although treatable, many post-trauma syndromes are never identified by the people who suffer from them, their family and friends, or the professionals who treat them. And unless we can identify the problem, it typically gets worse. Next, I'll mention the 7 criteria Dr. Conti mentions that establish what constitutes a post-trauma symptom. The first 2 describe the experience of trauma, whereas the subsequent 5 criteria describe symptoms we can recognize in ourselves and in others. Number 1, exposure. This criterion might seem straightforward, but this is not always the case. Acute trauma is often easy to identify, but chronic and vicarious trauma can prove difficult to pin down, especially when we add in the denial factor. We might be unable to admit to ourselves that we have been traumatized because the shame generated by the trauma can convince us that things will be worse if we acknowledge it. Shame also tells us that it was our fault, that people won't believe us, that we should remain quiet because other people have it worse, that we should just focus on the positive things in life, and so on. Shame uses endless arguments to keep us stuck in the grip of our trauma. Criterion 2, re-experience. Trauma re-experience means that a person continues to be haunted by what happened to them in the past. Some hauntings are more obvious than others. Sometimes we are quite clear on how our trauma are weaving their way through our minds, changing thoughts and feelings. This is most obvious after acute trauma. We know that we are different than before the trauma, and one of the worst things about that experience is confusion about who we are, feeling alienated from the self we are accustomed to knowing. I've had that. We can feel lost and desperate to regain control, and the fear generated by our thoughts during the experience can lead to even greater fear and shame, fueling trauma re-experience and making it even harder to admit what's happening and get help. It's easier in the moment, and it often seems safer to push the fear below the surface and move forward, hoping it will just go away. It's even more difficult if the situation is less obvious, which happens more frequently with chronic and vicarious trauma. It can take time for us to put together cause and effect, and we might not understand what's going on, why we are having the thoughts and feelings we're experiencing. Some of our decisions might even alarm us. Criterion number 3 is hypervigilance, and I had it too. We all have a threat sensor that usually lies below the surface of awareness that constantly surveys the sights, sounds, and sensations of our internal and external environment. You can be engaged in a relaxing activity like reading a book or watching a movie, but if that threat sensor sees an unexpected shadow or hears something suspicious in the next room, it will let you know immediately. Its purpose is to protect us, but not really bother the conscious part of our minds unless the threat calls for vigilance. However, when people suffer from trauma, their threat sensor becomes hyperactive and hypervigilant, constantly convincing them that things are dangerous and wrong right now. It's like the threat sensor recognizes that it was unable to prevent the initial trauma, and now it's trying to make up for it by being active and loud all the time. I'm aware that I acquired hypervigilance toward man. But like the body who cried wolf, when the threat sensor is always sounding the alarm, the brain eventually becomes fatigued and unable to differentiate false from real danger. Hypervigilance also results in ongoing tension, less enjoyment and ease, and increase in risk-taking and physical issues such as high blood pressure, heart disease, stroke, and even cancer. Criterion number 4 is increased baseline anxiety. Whereas hypervigilance is specifically overactivation of the brain's threat sensing function, trauma can raise baseline levels of anxiety as well. By anxiety here, I'm referring to an internal feeling of tension and discomfort that can diminish our ability to counter distress by using healthy coping skills. Anxiety can also negatively affect our coping skills by diminishing our perseverance, our ability to maintain self-confidence in the face of challenges, and our ability to orient towards self-soothing when we get upset or frazzled. The higher our baseline anxiety, the less we are able to access these coping skills. It's not too different from being out of shape and suffering from stiff joints and muscular tension. If we need to jump out of danger's way, we're not going to do so very skillfully. Additionally, increases in our baseline anxiety also lower distress tolerance, which refers to the amount of distress a person can put up with and still use good coping skills and make healthy decisions. The stress can come from vivid memories of the trauma that play over and over again in our minds, or from trauma-induced worries that we'll fail in our endeavors and feel embarrassed. External examples of this stress can include partners whose behavior reminds us of past abusers, experiencing bullying or prejudice, or being subjected to sexual harassment. Regardless of the form of our distress takes, we're better able to face it through strategy of healthy thoughts, compassion, and smart decisions. Trauma changes the whole internal playing field. Just as an athlete can't perform as well under adverse conditions, we're not at our best when trauma undermines our ability to function by throwing too much at us and messing with the control panels of our nervous system. That's what I was talking about resilience. The difference here is that an athlete will return to optimal performance when conditions return to normal, whereas trauma increases the likelihood of negative changes to body and mind. Criterion number 5 is decreased baseline mood. Mood and anxiety are strongly related. Trauma exposure, trauma re-experience, and hypervigilance all turn up the dial for anxiety, while simultaneously turning down the dial for mood. When we suffer from trauma, we become more prone to avoidance and isolation, which leads to decreased enjoyment of previously pleasurable activities. I used to organize fun activities, but after trauma, I hardly ever went out of the house for a couple of years. It isn't hard to roll the tape forward and see where this is going. Dr. Conti says he's heard a person describe themselves in words unimaginable before the traumatic event. One previously social person described himself as someone who lies below because people just don't like him. Another well-liked and formerly gregarious patient described herself as never getting along with anyone, so it's not even worth trying. In each case, the person looked surprised in the midst of uttering these phrases, and upon reflection, they couldn't tell if the words were false or if they became true at some point after the trauma occurred. This is just one more way trauma fools us about ourselves, using anxiety and a low mood to camouflage its actions. Criterion number 6, inadequate sleep. I've already talked about my sleep, but this is what Paul Conti says. Trauma attacks our sleep from every angle. It increases how long it takes to fall asleep and how many times we wake up during the night. And it decreases the length and quality of our sleep. This is obviously bad for our happiness, and health fatigue is correlated with an increase in injuries and accidents, and it often means more anxiety and dread while we're trying to get the sleep we so desperately need. In turn, this can lead to more foggy decision-making, avoidance, and the self-fulfilling prophecies of loneliness and disappointment. Our mental and physical health can decline, each compounding the negative effects of the other. Poor sleep is also associated with rumination. Those unproductive, negative, repetitive thoughts, "it will never work out," for example, or "I'm a terrible person." The more we repeat these things to ourselves, the more likely we are to believe them and act from those erroneous beliefs, especially when we consider that rumination happens both consciously and unconsciously as well. A person can find themselves wide awake in the middle of the night, thinking the same negative thoughts repeatedly, becoming more distressed about being awake and miserable, and not even realizing that the rumination has been going on just under the surface of sleep for hours. Needless to say, this destroys the restorative function of sleep. And finally, criterion number 7, behavior change. Even though changes in behavior are mentioned as an effect in most of the previously mentioned criteria, Dr. Conti thinks behavior change deserves its own category. This is because behavior changes quickly add up, multiply, and eventually lead us to unrecognized places with no obvious escape. In other words, trauma turns us into changed people without our understanding the extent, risk, or damage. People often comment about how different they are after experiencing trauma, and they have trouble uncovering the good parts about the people they once were. The way we act in the world affects the way we think and feel about ourselves, and thoughts and feelings change our behavior in turn. It's like using a map that's just a little bit off. Following a map like that might get us to our destination in a roundabout way, but more often than not, it gets us confused and lost. People suffering from post-trauma syndromes might experience all 7 of these criteria, or sometimes just the first 2, plus some combination of the others. In all cases, there are real changes in the person that cause unhappiness, increase suffering and risk, and decrease ease and resilience. These negative changes strike at the foundation of our very existence. Why I ended up temporarily working at a restaurant with my MBA diploma was that I experienced complex trauma and post-trauma syndromes. But I still have maintained my brain and my faith. And I think that's a powerful combination for someone who is determined to heal, which I am. I recognize that my brain also underwent changes, and at this point my brain doesn't have the same capacity to calculate and solve other problems that it had when I was taking my MBA course. But I'll dare to say that it is the same quality of brain and has a huge potential. Why am I saying that? It's because I have faith. In that sense, you can call me resilient. A quote from the Forbes magazine issue of March 19, 2025. Once upon a time, an MBA degree, especially from a top university, was considered a golden ticket. The idea was simple: Invest the time and money in a prestigious graduate degree in business, and doors would fly open to high-paying jobs and leadership roles in business, finance, or technology. But that's no longer the case. Many top companies, including Google, Meta, and IBM, don't require a university degree at all anymore, let alone an MBA. The skills taught in traditional business programs are increasingly seen as outdated, and employers are shifting their focus to creativity, adaptability, and real-world experience. I never got a job after I acquired my MBA degree because those jobs were in Riga, and my then husband would not move there for me. I was very sad, but I felt I had no bargaining power. I was also conditioned to striving to be what I understood a good wife and a good mother should be, but he never agreed that I succeeded in it. He thought I was self-centered because I took that MBA course while having a small child at home. It all turned out well because, having not been able to find a job, I founded a translation company and bought a Lexus SUV. The business enabled me to pay off my education and my Lexus credits in a few years, and now I have valuable self-taught skills that those who took the Riga jobs don't have. I'll stop this episode here by saying that I'm developing a quiz to help you determine if you are being blocked by trauma, and if yes, to what extent. I'm also including a part to help you determine how ready you are to change your life around. To get access to it, please visit my website, shebecameceo.com. And if you listen to this episode on the day it was published and the quiz is not yet there, but you want access to it, email me at support@shebecameceo.com and I'll send it to you as soon as I have it. I'll also put this information in the show notes. Thanks for listening to She Became CEO. If this episode sparked something in you, share it with a woman who is ready to reclaim her voice, her business, or her life. You can subscribe, leave a review, or explore more at shebecameceo.com. And remember, the transformation starts with you. Until the next time, lead boldly and speak your truth.